Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about how to teach sensory modulation in grades K through 5. And just so you know, we're going to hold the questions to the end just because I'm not able to see when the questions pop up when I'm sharing my PowerPoint at the same time. Just to give you some information about myself, I have been an occupational therapist for 25 years, and I have been primarily working in the schools for all 25 years, but in the district that I work in now, I've been there for 20 years, and I'm in upstate New York. And I've also been a worldwide presenter for 16 years, where I've gotten to travel around the country and present webinars in all different types of formats and internationally. And I am the owner of OTKimWiggins LLC. And I have 3 children and a great husband, and a lot of what I do usually has to do with, I usually get my children to be models for me. But anyway, so one of the reasons I wanted to tell you that is I wanted to tell you why I wrote this curriculum, the Just Right for K through 5, along with Gwen Wild, and also the Just Right Junior. I have known for the last 25 years, the most popular referrals to OT are still handwriting and sensory. And since the pandemic, I think that we're seeing even more of a regression in handwriting and an increase in sensory. And I realized that over the years, managing sensory diets, sensory plans is really difficult. It's hard to stay on top of it, especially if you have a large caseload or in a large district. And it's also difficult if you are a remote therapist, or you might live in a rural area that you don't get to visit schools as much as you'd like. What happens when you make a sensory plan for a student sometimes is that it's not used the way you want it to, or maybe it's not functional, or maybe it's lost, or maybe there's just like a little honeymoon period where it's being used for a short period of time, and then I don't know what happens, right? And so for years I was getting frustrated. And whose fault is it? And I realized, it was a big aha moment. I realized it was mine. I was handing out equipment, I was dictating activities. I really never taught the students or the teachers or the parents about self-awareness and why they would choose those strategies. I would just make the sensory diets and choose the strategies for them. And I mean, obviously I would ask the kids sometimes, and I just assumed they would like those activities, right? And that's just it. Did I always choose them and not the student? Yeah, that's pretty much what was going on. And there was very little collaboration, mostly because I didn't have time. And that's usually the biggest issue in schools, especially. But it's even the case if you're making sensory diets, if you're a school-based therapist or a clinic-based therapist or a homeschooled, you're working in homes, it still is the same type of thing. So when I started using the BrainWorks program many years ago, it was a game changer for me because I had a lot of resources at my fingertips, but I still felt like something was missing. And like, how do I teach it to them in an effective way that I'm getting the most amount of collaboration with teachers and with the students, and it's frequent, right? So I asked my good friend Gwen Wild, because is the creator of BrainWorks, and I said, did you ever think about making a program of like how to teach the BrainWorks programs to the kids, like with lesson plans and things like that? And that's where the Just Right curriculum was born. And what it does is it actually just saves me time, because the lessons are completely created for you already. And, with caseloads of up to 80 students at a time, sometimes I really don't have time for a lot of that planning. So anyway, I just wanted to tell you the little background about the Just Right curriculum. And this past summer, I wrote the Just Right Junior. And so both of these products are available through Therapro. I also wanted to just put Gwen's face out here because we co-authored this together. So I wanted you to be able to put a face to the name. And our goals for you today are really that we want you to be able to understand and explain to other people what sensory modulation disorder is. I want you to be able to feel comfortable teaching something like this, or sensory modulation in general, to other people. And I want you to be able to know all the different components of the curriculum so that you could teach it effectively and you feel more comfortable doing it. So in order to teach sensory modulation, I think it's extremely important to touch on social emotional learning. So social and emotional learning is definitely like a buzzword topic, right, for a few years now, and something that most school districts are really pushing for, or at least developing or utilizing social and emotional learning programs or curricula that they are teaching to the entire school, or even to certain grades. A lot of times, like in my school district, the social worker and the school psychologist pushes into every single classroom to teach a curriculum for social and emotional learning. Sometimes it's the teacher's responsibility, and sometimes the schools don't have them and they're kind of just, each teacher is kind of trying to figure it out themselves. So social and emotional learning is defined as a process for helping children gain critical skills for life effectiveness, such as developing positive relationships, behaving ethically, and handling challenging situations effectively. That's stuff that even adults have a hard time with, right? So specifically, strategies that foster social and emotional learning help children recognize and manage emotions. Nice. Think about their feelings. Great. And how they should act and regulate their behavior based on decision making. Whew, that is a lot, right? That's a challenge. In 1994, an organization called CASEL, CASEL, it stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. It was created in 1994, and it focused on introducing the concept of social emotional learning. So the CASEL website is a really great resource, and even if you already have a program or social emotional curriculum in your school, definitely take a look at it. It's castle.org, and you can find some amazing handouts and processes to guide this in your district if you need to, or just have additional resources. So it is really, really helpful. So what I want to do is that I want to explain in the from Castle, what they did is they created 5 core components to social and emotional learning. And these 5 core components are like the basis behind all of their program of teaching children and teachers how to develop their skills for social and emotional learning. So those are the 5. There's 5 of them. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you what they are one at a time, and each time that I do, I'm going to connect them with how OTs or how sensory modulation can connect to social emotional learning. Okay. So I also want to just keep this in mind. All of us who are therapists, teachers, parents, we all have different experiences, right? Some of us, if you're working with kids, get excited about helping kids with mental health. I was always a therapist that was very interested in mental health. Some therapists or some teachers actually feel like addressing mental health is kind of scary, or it makes them nervous. And especially OTs, right? There's a lot of carryover between sensory modulation and social emotional learning and mental health. A lot of OTs go into mental health as their main, area. And some OTs have gotten into OT for motor skills, right? And not mental health. So it's just really, really important that everyone, no matter what type of therapist you are, what type of teacher, what type of parent you are, you still understand what the 5 core competencies are. So the first one is self-awareness, and it is the ability to understand your own emotions and thoughts and values and how they influence the behavior across contexts. Okay, so you're being aware of your own emotions. Now, there's lots of components that really probably could connect with this, but I think the 3 biggest ones, the first one is interoception. Interoception, how does that impact self-awareness? It is the awareness of a whole body function, right? And in interoception, it happens in the cortex of the brain. And that is the part of the brain that gives us information about what's happening inside our bodies. Like, is our muscle tone high? Is our heart beating faster than normal? Is our stomach jittery or tense? And that information tells us what emotion we are feeling. As babies, when we were crying because we were thirsty or hungry, and all of a sudden someone came over to us with a bottle, that's like the first time it connected, right? And so we may figure out that when our stomach feels butterflies or your heart is beating really fast, that you might be scared or nervous. Well, scared or nervous are two different emotions, right? But either way, they tend to be more negative emotions, right? But that could also mean that they're excited. So how do you know the difference, right? And that's that internal self-awareness. So that's interoception. And when we learn to identify our emotions based on how we feel internally, it helps develop our self-awareness. So if we have a lack of interoceptive awareness, it's going to be very hard for our self-awareness to develop in general. And I won't feel like I really know myself, or I'm just kind of guessing at things all the time, and nothing ever really works as a strategy because I don't understand it. Another thing is body awareness. And if I don't know where my body is in space, how do I understand where I am when I'm standing next to other people or myself in relation to other people? So, body awareness is kind of like where interoception and proprioception come together to give us an idea of where our bodies are or where our parts of our body are in relationship to one another. And then a third component is executive functioning skills. And this is where interoception, this is where this happens in the frontal lobe as well. And it helps us to be self-reflective, right? It helps us to be self-critical, self-reflective, and it helps us to become more self-aware so that we retain that information. So self-awareness is huge, right? It's especially important for sensory modulation. Self-management. This is another biggie for sensory self-regulation. It is defined as the ability to manage one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations to achieve goals and aspirations. So now self-awareness was the ability to understand your own emotions. Management is now how do you manage them? You can't manage them if you're not aware of what they are, right? So this is very similar to self-regulation. Very, very similar definitions. I think OTs are always talking about self-regulation. Other people, I mean, I think everybody talks about self-regulation these days, but we might use programs like the zones of regulation, or we might use BrainWorks or any other kind of sensory diet kind of program to address self-regulation or self-management to impact things that we need to be able to change our behavior, right? Depending on what we need. One of the things is movement control. Now, kids that are constantly moving, maybe impulsively, or maybe they're moving in inappropriate times, or they're hyperactive, right? That's your ability to control when and how and the intensity of your movement. Impulse control is when just kids might just lack the mental breaks to actually control what they should be doing next, right? And they just act. That's their impulse control. And then we have our emotional control, and that's how when kids just get upset during unexpected times. Now, is it appropriate to get upset if something really upsetting happens? Absolutely, right? But that's how we control ourselves when maybe we feel like crying when it's not the most appropriate time to do it, or it's going to impact our learning or our social relationships, right? So a lot of us are now looking at some of these areas and we're thinking, okay, I can see how maybe OT skills or different things that I might do with sensory skills might actually impact our social emotional learning. So social awareness is the ability to understand the perspectives of and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts, okay? So it develops by reading other people's body language, okay? So we have to be not just know what the body language is, but what those body languages mean, right? Also also the tone of voice, okay? So tone of voice makes a difference. A lot of times I say to some of my students, especially my students with autism, I'll say, look at my face right now. Does my face look happy or sad or mad, right? And so it's really kind of giving them some clues. Look at my eyebrows. Look at my face. Look at my mouth. you know, like those types of body clues, or if our arms are crossed, right? So sometimes we have to be very explicit with our body language and explaining what those things mean. Same with tone of voice, same with facial expression. And we do that through the development of empathy. So as we pick up on all those different types of body languages, tone of voice, facial expressions, we are developing empathy as we put ourselves in other people's shoes so that we can understand, oh, that's how they must be mad at me, or they must be very sad right now. Maybe it's not the best time to make a joke, right? So in addition to that, what do we use in order to be able to see all those things? Our visual processing and our auditory processing, right? We need to have those sensory skills intact in order to be able to pick up on any of those things, which will then in turn affect our social awareness. Our relationship skills. So this is the fourth one. Relationship skills are the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships and to effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. So we think about kids that we work with that struggle with maybe tactile input, right? Or maybe they over respond when someone bumps into them in line, and then they lash out by punching somebody, right? That doesn't really make for very good relationships, you know? Kids who lack the ability also to express their wants and needs end up being screamers or criers or fussers, and it severely impacts their relationships with other peers and even teachers and even adults and even parents, right? And then time management, that could be another one that we use our prefrontal lobe for that. Like if you're always running late, people start getting frustrated with you, right? If you're a teenager and you say you're going to be there at 6, but you get there at 8, they're probably going to be frustrated with you and annoyed with you. Or perhaps you're getting your assignments in very late, and that affects your relationships with teachers, right? So that's a piece of that. And these are not all the things, but I'm just giving you examples. And then the last and final core competency of social emotional learning is responsible decision making. And we can see how executive functioning skills like planning and prioritizing and self-reflection and critical thinking all play a major role with making decisions, right? All of those things impact your decision making, including the other 4 core competencies. So now I just want to show you these 2 pyramids. The left is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you're probably familiar with. And then the physiological needs are at the very bottom. Like, is the child fed? You know, are the basic needs met? Food, water, sleep, shelter, clothing, breathing, just are you able to breathe? You know, those types of things. Is he hungry or tired? The next level is safety. So like, does the child come from a safe and caring home? SEL, social emotional learning, is addressing the top 2 or 3 tiers on this pyramid. So first and foremost, we have to make sure that their basic needs are being met, and they need them to feel safe in order for them to progress up the pyramid of social emotional, to get to the point where they can actually learn social emotional learning, right? The pyramid on the right is called the pyramid of learning, which you're probably familiar with as well. And it makes a lot of sense. And it comes from the ALERT program that's been around for a while. They've given me permission to use this in my courses. And it lays out a nice framework for development. It's how natural development occurs. And hopefully we develop a healthy nervous system from birth and on, right? And then we move to looking at the sensory systems individually, and then look at processing and integration to occur. And when we get a little bit higher, we see things like reflex maturity, eye-hand coordination, visual input. Then we get to the very top of the pyramid, and we see things like behavior and learning and ADLs, right? And we can't get to the top of the pyramid successfully without a solid foundation established at the bottom. So today what we're going to be doing is focusing on sensory modulation, which is one of the components of sensory processing. And sensory modulation, I just wanted to add it to these graphics because I think that they're very important parts of both pyramids, okay? It plays the biggest impact on social skills, behavior, and academic learning. So we're going to have to focus on solidifying the bottom tiers of these pyramids. And in order to do that, we need a solid foundation to have stability and success at the higher levels. So why would sensory modulation be in basic needs or in safety? Well, a lot of times if you feel uncomfortable in your own skin, you do not feel safe. If you are super sensitive to auditory input, and every time you go into the bathroom to use the toilet and it flushes, it literally hurts you, right? It hurts your ears, and you avoid drinking so that you avoid using the toilet. Those are basic needs that are not being met, and it's all because of a sensory modulation issue. So just keep that in mind. Now, sensory processing disorder is it's an umbrella diagnosis, and modulation is one component of sensory processing. There's 3 types of sensory processing disorders. The first one is sensory-based motor disorder, and this is like dyspraxia. It's like your clumsy kids that might also get physical therapy. Dyspraxia can also affect speech or eating, and then another type is actually postural disorder. And then a second type of sensory processing disorder is sensory discrimination disorder. It allows me to tell the difference between one thing or in the other, or if they're similar. So if I reach into my pocket and I have a couple of things in my pocket and I need my keys, right? I'm able to figure out the difference between the keys and other things. And this holds true for all of the senses, not just touch. Touch is just one. Discriminating noises and auditory, right? So if you hear, your car alarm outside, you stop and you think, and then you're like, that's not my car, it's not over there. Or as soon as you hear the fire alarm, you automatically have been trained to get up, right? Though there's certain different types of sounds. And I could argue that, a mother or father's voice is not a priority. Sometimes that's not a priority. And they wait until the voice is Joshua, instead of Josh, 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 Joshua. They have to wait till they get to that point. So they are discriminating between those different types of auditory inputs. The same thing with visual inputs, smells. Smells are huge. Olfactory sense is a huge piece. Like the difference between the smell of a campfire and actual fire, right? Being able to know when and where those things are appropriate, or maybe chemicals like Clorox or something. Like if you go to put something in your mouth and it smells like a chemical, do you still put it in your mouth? Those types of things. And then there's sensory modulation disorder. And sensory modulation disorder has 3 components to it, which are sensory over responsivity, sensory under responsivity, and sensory either craving or seeking. Those go hand in, those are the same. And so modulation is the component that is most impacted through a sensory diet approach. And that's the piece that we're going to be talking about the most today. The well-modulated person, okay, is hard to come by, but I think most of us are probably well modulated. We can get a little more or a little less sensory input. Although these days, I don't know, I feel like way more distracted than I ever have been in my life. But the vast majority of car accidents are actually caused by people whose brains are not helping them focus on what is most important at the moment. So right now, what you're doing is you're listening to my voice and watching this presentation. That's your job right now. But you might hear, your dog barking or your kids arguing back there, or somebody's making dinner or whatever, but you are still focused. Even though you hear all of those things, you're filtering out the unimportant stimuli so that you can pay attention to what is most important at that moment. Now, you're also able, a well-modulated person is also able to reflect appropriate emotional and behavioral responses to situations versus environment. So this is a really good clue for us if we're thinking about whether something is a sensory issue or a behavior issue. And we hear that all the time. Is that sensory or is it behavior? Is it sensory or behavior? For example, I've had teachers say to me, like, I can't put my finger on what the problem is. Like, we had an assembly the other day with a performer, and Sally was talking about it for weeks. She was so excited and happy about it. But instead, when it actually came through, she wasted the entire afternoon having a meltdown outside the auditorium. And you're like, I don't get it. Same thing happens at birthday parties. Okay. It doesn't make sense to most people because theoretically they should be happy. They should be excited about this situation, right? She was doing something she enjoyed. her family was going to be there and they were coming to watch. Also, situationally, everything was fine. So why was she having a meltdown? And most likely it was because of the environment. It was sending her into a sensory overload, everything from the noise level of the performer, the lighting, to the amount of interaction that was being required of her or attention required from her, like a birthday party. Think about how crazy birthday parties can get, right? So reacting to the environment like this or that is typically an indicator that this is a sensory-based issue. However, if the meltdowns tend to be more situational, like maybe they always melt down when they're asked to do a non-preferred task, like they're always melting down every time you ask them to take a bath or every time you ask them to read or write, right? That's not a sensory issue. That's more of a situational issue because it doesn't matter what the environment is. It's always the same situation, right? It's more likely an issue in behavior than it is in nature. And everyone has sensory issues. We all have sensory issues. We all have little things that bother us. We all, whether, things we like, things that we don't like, we realize certain things help us pay attention, help us be able to get through the day, right? And as adults, we naturally become more independent. Like we pop a piece of gum in our mouth, or we stand up, or we maybe, right now you might need to go get a drink of water or something like that. Kids have a harder time doing that because it's also a matter of like compliance in the classroom, right? And it just depends on the environment of what they're being allowed to do and the age that they are probably. And most likely those little things that we do don't impact us significantly, but we figured it out, right? And this is why I think it is extremely important to teach kids about their own sensory needs at a very young age, because people are just throwing out, oh, I have sensory issues. Oh, it's like a joke almost, like, oh, there's my sensory issues again, right? But what does that actually mean? And it's not really an excuse, right? There is a basis behind it. It's a little bit of a pet peeve for me, probably as an OT, but we all need to be more understanding of what helps each other, how we can help each other, and what we can use for tools. And there is no normal anymore, right? There's no normal. There never was any normal. We all just have to figure out how we respond to different things and be empathetic to people who might be responding differently to something that we don't respond to the same. Now, with sensory modulation disorders, for some kids, modulation doesn't develop as it should. Okay. There are a lot of contributing factors, both genetics, both environmental issues, right, that impact them. What we do know is that kids need access to a multi-sensory environment, as well as adults who can assist with co-regulation when needed, right? Co-regulation, I've been realizing in the last few years, like, that's one of the things I think why I do get some success. I think I might not have co-regulation mastered in my house, but I definitely have figured it out over the last 25 years working with kids in the school. When they have these big behaviors, I don't have reactions. I don't have big reactions to their big behaviors, right? I try to co-regulate, and I change the subject. I change the sensory environment. It's almost like an acting thing that we tend to probably do, but we have to figure out how to regulate ourselves, which can be difficult when we're having those big behaviors. And then kids tend to co-regulate with us, okay? And we need that in order for their sensory systems to have a chance to develop in a typical manner and to be able to figure out what they need, right? Because if we start yelling back, now we've just added auditory input to the situation, right? If we start touching them or moving them to different places, now we've just added tactile input to the situation. The overload has just exploded even more so, right? So the other problem is that this does not happen if kids are seated in front of electronics all day, right? If we do that, they're not getting input from all 8 sensory systems on a regular basis to be able to develop them, to be able to know that you like this or you don't like this, right? Because you just never get a chance to do it. Now, At one end of the continuum, we have sensory over responders. And there's a great book out there called Too Loud, Too Bright, Too Fast, Too Tight. It's actually written for adults with sensory processing disorder. But I just love that title because it so accurately describes how over responders feel all the time, right? They feel frazzled and overwhelmed. Think about when you are just like, oh my gosh, I can't think of anything else or hear anything else. It's driving me crazy. This is how they respond to almost every sensory input. And imagine just being like on high alert all the time, right? How stressful that is. And then learning to read, learning to do math, learning to socially interact with other people, other first graders, right? That's hard. Now, on the other end of the continuum, we have sensory under responders. Everyone on that end of the continuum are demonstrating under responsive reactions to the sensory stimuli. And what that really means is that they need more sensory input. Either they need more in intensity or they need more in duration. But what they need is more, okay? And in order to get more, they have to have the same neurochemical response in the brain that the rest of us get through just normal life activities, right? We get vestibular input every time we bend over to tie our shoe, right? Now, that's not enough for kids that are under responders, right? There are two different types of under responders. At the top of the fork in the road, we have our sensory seekers, sometimes called sensory cravers, and these people have an under responsive reaction to sensory input, and they seem to know that, and they are actively seeking more input all day, every day, through every sense, or some senses more than others, like whatever it is. Maybe they're running and they're jumping and they're spinning and they're crashing and they're driving their teachers crazy, probably in an attempt to get more input. But this is actually an adaptive response. They are literally trying to get more, right? And that's where we would come in and be able to teach them that. Like, I am noticing that you're doing this. It looks like you need a tool for your body. It looks like you need a tool for your mouth. It looks like you need a tool for your hands, those types of things, right? And the more we say that repetitively, repeatedly, I guess is the word, then it starts to get ingrained. Oh, when I act like this, that means I need this, right? And they're trying to meet a need. At the bottom of the fork of under responders, we have our passive under responders. And these are kids that are having an under responsive reaction to incoming stimuli, but they're not really doing anything about it. Okay. They also need more, but they aren't doing much, right? It also could be connected to their personality type. Many of these passive under responders are what we refer to as being kind of like laid back, okay, or couch potatoes, or maybe, bump on a log kind of stuff, right? And if that's the case, maybe they even know that they need more information, but they perceive it as way too much work, right? They need so much. What's the point? I'm never going to get to that point, right? And it's a lot of effort. Or it could be that they never actually get to the point where they feel good. They never get that neurochemical response. So for whatever the reason is, they just seem to give up on getting the more, and that more would actually help their brains, but they tend to slump and tune out and daydream and disengage. And these are the kids that you're like, Brian, 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 and like they just cannot. So it's like they don't hear you, right? But they need a lot of sensory input, and their brains just aren't getting enough to keep their brains like on, right? Now, what I like to do is also just kind of give you, it's kind of like, this is a good place to start if you're unsure of what sensory inputs certain people with certain kids might have. Now, this is not the end all be all for every person with autism spectrum disorder. It is typical, not completely, it's just common that if a person with autism tends to be over responsive to the far senses, meaning that they tend to be sensitive to visual input, auditory input, touch, taste, smell. That's why we have a lot of picky eaters that are also on the autism spectrum, right? Or they don't like the sounds, or they get very distracted by the visual input, or they don't want to be touched, or they're sensitive to clothes, right? And then they also tend to be under responsive to the near senses, which are proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. So, they don't like to be touched. They don't like certain foods, but they love spinning. They're always rocking. They fall out of their chair on purpose. They push into the wall or into other people, or maybe they hit themselves in the head or other people in the head, or they bite their skin, or interoception, perhaps they are not yet toilet trained, or they're always hungry. But are they always hungry, or they just don't know what that feeling is in their stomach, so they eat because they connect that with that, right? Or they don't have very good temperature regulation, and they just push themselves until they're like sweating, and it's not the most ideal, right? So you could see where there might be little changes in certain people or whatever. For the most part, a lot of students, children with autism spectrum disorder, have this kind of recipe of sensory processing disorder. And if you're not really sure, and you've done your checklist and you're still not really sure, you could start here, right? And when you're making your sensory diets. Now, as far as ADHD versus sensory processing disorder, ADHD is a chemical imbalance, and unfortunately, they just cannot stop impulsive behavior, regardless what kind of sensory input they have, right? And unfortunately, ADHD medication does not typically help kids that have a true sensory processing disorder. Can kids have both? Yeah, we see that more and more nowadays. But really, if it's usually one or the other is more prominent. Okay. So sensory input typically has little effect on ADHD. Okay. And it's like I said, ADHD is a chemical imbalance. They just can't stop that. If you give somebody with sensory processing disorder ADHD medication and it doesn't help, it's probably an indication that they have more of a sensory processing disorder, right? Also, like I said, sensory input has little effect on ADHD. They do not become more organized after receiving intense sensory input. I have had kids on very intense sensory diets on a regular, like every half an hour. Then they also have the environmental modifications in the classroom. They are on spinning protocols. They are on brushing protocols. They have the most intense types of sensory inputs, and it makes little to no difference, right? Also, vice versa, sensory sensitivities or craving behaviors do not seem to resolve with ADHD medication, right? Because if you give that intense sensory input to a person with sensory processing disorder, it actually does make a difference, right? Also, I think this was my big aha moment when I heard this many years ago. Kids with ADHD crave novelty. These are literally the kids that are buzzing around the classroom, but a new person comes in the room, or maybe like the Zoomobile comes, or a new movie comes out. They are front and center, the most attentive they've ever been. And it's usually when the school psychologists come in to observe them, right? But they crave novelty, new stuff. New stuff elicits a ton of new neurochemicals, the excitement of that, right? It makes them more attentive. Does that make sense? However, people with sensory processing disorder, novelty experiences, new experiences typically create more dysregulation. New environments, new people, new voices, new clothes, right? That is usually a sensory processing disorder. Now, dysregulation seems to follow a pattern with sensory processing disorder, right? And it might happen, whatever the behavior is, it might happen at a particular time of day. It might happen with certain types of activities, with certain types of foods, like certain specific things. You can usually figure that out. And that is not the case with ADHD, right? There's no pattern to that. But I do have to say that with people with ADHD, Those cognitive strategies, like those behavior plans, the reward systems, they tend to work much better with people with ADHD than they do with sensory processing disorder. Because seriously, sensory processing disorder can, people with sensory processing disorder cannot, that doesn't mean anything to them, right? They really do either need the input or get rid of the input in order to be able to feel calm. Now, this is the sensory emotional continuum. This is how emotions overlap with sensory modulation. Now, research on neurochemicals shows that the same neurochemicals are present and abundant in your brain, whether it's one of these emotions, anxious, stressed, frustrated, and angry, or if you're being over responsive to sensory input. They cause each other. What happened first, the chicken or the egg, right? So if I'm anxious, I will end up feeling more over responsive to sensory input. For example, say I'm anxious and I walk into the classroom and I'm a second grader and I just had a terrible morning with my family on the way to school, or maybe I don't know, the bus was overstimulating, or I got into a fight with my mom, or we didn't have breakfast. There was no money to buy breakfast food. We didn't eat, I get into school. I'm frustrated. I'm stressed out. I'm nervous. Everything I see becomes over responsive to me, right? And it's especially if it's loud in the classroom or there's chaos, right? I'm more likely to feel overwhelmed from the sounds and the sights of the classroom compared to if I walked into a less stimulating environment. So I also say the same thing happens with me, right? If I've had a hard day at work and I walk into the same house I walk into every single day, and there's a bunch of stuff all over the place, and I'm already anxious and stressed out, I flip out on the fact that there's shoes and there's coats all over the place, right? But if I walked in and I was in a decent, happy mood, this is not that big of a deal to me. I'm not as overstimulated, right? I'm not as over responsive to the visual input or the sounds happening. So again, they kind of go in together. So then the same thing happens with the affects and emotions of being hyper, giddy, and manic. They have the same neurochemicals present in the brain as being under responsive to sensory input. So I tend to look like I'm sensory seeking if I'm laughing and jumping and touching everybody and being in their space, because I am sensory seeking, but I'm also having the same hyper, giddy, or manic kind of behavior or emotions, right? And then the same goes for passive under responders. Being content and melancholy and unmotivated has the same neurochemicals as being a passive under responder. So did I have the emotion that caused us to respond to sensory input, or did the sensory input cause the emotion? It's a little tricky, but the point is, it doesn't matter. They go hand in hand with each other, and you don't know what happened first, but it's extremely important when it comes to social emotional learning. And then as far as strategies go, this is what's going to help you come up with your strategies. If you see one of the affects on the left, we're going to use calming strategies for these people. I can't figure it out. I see him looking frustrated and stressed out. I don't know if it's over responsive or not, but I know he's anxious, stressed, frustrated, or angry. So I'm going to use calming strategies. Okay. And we might have to modify the environment or provide some sort of calming exercise or deep pressure or proprioceptive input, right? Or noise canceling headphones, which kind of does both, because usually it provides like that suction on your ear, which provides the proprioception and it takes out the sound, which is really helpful. Okay. If you show an emotion that's on the right side, we're going to be using alerting types of strategies. And in general, 90% of the time, affect can be your guide and your best friend when you're trying to figure out a sensory diet. We don't have to be 100% convinced that it's a sensory issue, because we're going to use the same types of strategies. Think about social workers. They've been giving sensory strategies out for years, right? And it's because stress balls, deep breaths, yoga, those types of strategies tend to be calming because they tend to be anxious, stressed, frustrated, or angry, right? So here's another example. And I say this example a lot. Say you have a student that has autism and they bang their heads, okay? I don't know. They're nonverbal. I don't know why they're banging their head. They can't tell me, right? But something is happening. So if I walk into the classroom and they call me as the OT and they're like, Joey is banging his head and he won't stop. He won't stop. Or maybe he's biting. He won't stop. I walk into the room and I look and Joey is agitated or he's crying and he's banging his head or he's biting his skin. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go with whatever's on the left side, right? And I'm going to say he's probably upset about something. So the first thing that I can do as the OT is look around in the environment. Is it the sound? Is it the light? Is it his clothes? Is it certain things that I can help decrease away from him? Or was it the task? Was it a situational task, right? And then we just have to take a break from it and come back, those types of things, right? Maybe it's too noisy. Maybe it's too bright. I don't know what it is because he can't tell me. So I'm going to do calming types of strategies. Maybe it requires proprioception. Maybe it requires calming music. Maybe it requires vibration, right? So then what if the same situation, they're like, oh, Joey's headbanging again. Come on in. Can you help us? And I walk in and Joey is laughing and he's headbanging, right? That tells me that he's on the hyper giddy manic side. He's sensory seeking input because that's the type of behavior that's the same neurochemicals. And so he needs more input. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to give him a harder surface so he can bang his head on it, right? I'm going to do something else. He's craving something. He likes the way this feels. I need him to get proprioception in a different way, right? Or more input in a different way. And hopefully that will help the behavior. Now, we'll pretend this is Mrs. Smith's class. Mrs. Smith has 20 kids in her classroom. And of all those kids, maybe she has somebody like this boy who is scripting and seeking sensory input all day long. He does not have auditory filtering. He has poor eye contact. He has limited social interactions. Are these going to affect his social emotional skills? Absolutely, right? Because he's having underlying reasons that are affecting him. He's seeking tactile proprioception and vestibular input all day long, but yet he's also sensitive to noises and in his own world sometimes. And sometimes he'll have a tantrum, and the sensory seeking behaviors tend to increase during that time, right? So we need to address the root of the problem. Then we have maybe this cutie over here, and this kid is constantly sensory seeking. He also has a diagnosis of ADHD, but his meds are not consistent. And he has a kind of an unfortunate family life, and he has a split home, multiple parent figures. He is a messy eater. He is constantly standing and talking loudly, and he wears the same clothes every single day, and his clothes often smell, and he has toileting issues, and he's very social with his peers, but his peers don't want to be social with him. Does that affect his social emotional learning skills? Yep. Definitely. Then we might have this little dolly over here. She is has like severe motor planning things going on and fine motor skill delays, but she's not able to write more than 2 letters at a time, and she avoids all the writing that she could possibly do. So she tends to move around the classroom and talk to anyone who wants to talk to her, and it distracts her from completing her work. She's also embarrassed by her writing, so her self-awareness is there, but she has no self-management to overcome those issues. Is that a social emotional learning issue? Absolutely. And then we have this guy who has a very complicated life as well. Tantrums every day, flips the table once a week, cursing, beautiful fine motor skills, beautiful writing, but he hates to do any adult directed task or anything that requires anybody else having control. So what do we do when we have a classroom full of all of these kids that all have their own little quirks, and we have those 4 kids in the background, right? It's a lot harder for a teacher to handle this, right? As therapists, we might come in and want to specifically address these 4 kids, but you have to look at the whole picture here, right? This is a teacher trying to manage all of these 20 kids in a classroom. So if you are working in a classroom as a therapist, a teacher, even if you're doing stuff as a parent, it is very helpful. And maybe they don't have a social emotional learning curriculum. This is a list of children's books that primarily correlate with sensory issues that connect with social emotional learning. The first link can be used with the zones of regulation, so you can kind of like correlate with them with that. And then the second one is more about sensory processing stuff. And it's just children's books that are available. And this is very, very helpful. Something you can see behind my head too, this is the Just Right bulletin board, and this is available on my website, OTKimWiggins.com. But I have these posted in every single hallway in the schools that I work in, because it's just constantly reiterating it. You know, how do you feel? Do I feel slow, just right, or fast? You turn your little spinner thing over to wherever you feel. Okay, I feel fast, so that means I go to the green side. Now I have to decide, am I fast and hyper, or am I fast and stressed, right? If I'm feeling fast and stressed, I need to calm down, because that would be the left side of the continuum. If I'm feeling fast and hyper, I'm on the right side of the curriculum or continuum, so I need to fill my tank with a lot of more intense sensory input, because I need more. Right. And the same thing goes for these other ones. So these are great visuals that you can utilize that coincide with the Just Right K-5 curriculum. But they're PDFs, and then you print them and laminate them and hang them up. The other thing is environmental modifications, right? We can either add opportunities for sensory experiences, or we can decrease the amount of sensory experiences that they might be overstimulated by. There's a really great link here. It's called 23 Ways to Create a Sensory Friendly Classroom. And there's lots of really great ideas in there. And I think a lot of us have those great ideas. It's just nice to see them all in one spot. And what I've done with this document is actually went ahead and printed it, and then went to a teacher's classroom, and we collaborated together about, yes, I want to do that. No, I don't like that idea. You know, those types of things. So, you know, we can kind of change that up. So now we have this lovely little classroom again. What are some tier 1 interventions that a classroom teacher can implement into the classroom, and maybe even with collaboration from us, right? One of the things is to adapt the environment. Maybe we add some sort of calming corner, okay? If you add a calming corner, it is this is another one of my pet peeves. I hate when we just add calming corners and then we don't explicitly teach it to the kids. And then even worse than that, we might explicitly teach it to the kids in the beginning, and now it's April and we never talked about it again, right? Reiterate it. Kids do not remember things the first time around. Anyone should know that, right? So there needs to be a signage in there. There needs, like, maybe even a bulletin board, a mini version of that could be there. There has to be a variety of different tools, because we have those 20 kids in that classroom, not just these 4. Right? So we need to have all different types of options in there. We can also add sensory equipment to the classroom. You can add a trampoline. I particularly like the Bosu ball, and the reason I like that is because you can easily pick that up and tuck it away somewhere. You can add, you know, sensory paths to the hallway. You can also make sensory paths on like a runner, like a carpet runner, or on different types of things that you can just like throw out, and you can buy them that way as well. And you can use them in the classroom, so you don't have to, like, it's not embedded onto the ground. You just can roll it out when you need it, that type of thing. You can also use adapted seating. There's tons and tons of choices for adapted seating that are available. I just put ball chairs here for an example. Also, fidgets, right? Fidgets often become toys. And so we need to have a variety of fidgets that meets the needs of a variety of different types of children. But the more they look like toys, the more they're going to be a toy. Okay, so I have them on there. There can be some visual things on there. You can make sure that you're doing different types of movement breaks. Not everyone loves Go Noodle. Okay, so there's different types of things that are out there. There's sensory paths. There's different YouTube channels that are available out here. One of them is P.E. Bowman. One is Cosmic Kids. That's a yoga one. And I'm not saying only do Cosmic Kids and only do P.E. Bowman. I'm saying if you're doing a movement break every half hour or hour, every time you do it, I use a different website, because it's going to hit different kids in different ways, right? Because everybody responds differently. And, maybe we put the zones of regulation, and maybe we use different types of programs that are available out there as well, right? One of the things that we can utilize, a teacher can utilize, or a therapist can utilize, is by teaching a curriculum to the entire classroom. Now, these 4 kids, they need to learn about self-regulation. Absolutely. Could we pull them out and do a small group? Yeah, probably, or someone can, right? But then what about the other 16 kids in the classroom? What about the teacher in the classroom, right? These 4 kids learn about things, but how are they going to be carried over on a daily basis if they're not being taught in the classroom? So the easiest way to do this, whether it's a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 approach, is to teach the curriculum to the entire classroom for the sake of these 4 kids, right? But it's not going to hurt anybody else, because everybody needs to learn about sensory processing, because everybody has sensory issues, right? And it's just one of those things where we just need to have the same terminology. We're utilizing the terminology. The peers can help other peers know what to choose or what to do, because they are learning the same exact thing. Okay. So this is where using a curriculum, and there's lots of different versions out there. And this is a course about sensory modulation and about the Just Right K-5 program. The Just Right Junior I also did a webinar on Just Right Junior that is also available through Therapro. They're both also available through my website as well. So what we're going to do now is for the last half hour, we're going to kind of just go through the Just Right K-5 curriculum so that you can kind of understand it a little bit better and see how teaching a curriculum really might help the majority of your students. Whether, say for example, like today I taught Just Right Junior to a kindergarten classroom. I have one OT student in there that has sensory self-regulation issues. And then I have another student in there who gets OT for fine motor skills. And so the lovely thing about the Just Right K-5 and the Just Right Junior is that when we created these programs, we had that in mind. I can't just go into a classroom and only teach sensory self-regulation without also focusing on communication, on fine motor skills, on even gross motor skills. I need it to be a whole child approach, because it incorporates all of their skills, all of their needs into those lessons. And it's not just talking about self-regulation, right? I need them to do things with their hands. I need them to be working on cutting. I need them to be practicing writing. That way it hits everyone in a different way, and everybody's improving their skills in general. So these are available. That's what we're going to talk about. So real quick, we're going to talk about how Just Right is actually evidence-based. Gwen Wild, who's the co-author of K-5, the Just Right K-5, she led a study and published it in the International Journal of Special Education using the brain work activity cards and using them in a classroom in the same types of strategies and sensory breaks and sensory strategies that were used with the Just Right curriculum. They use a couple of different measures, okay? And this is what the Just Right curriculum is based on. And what they saw was actually that they were making the most impact on social skills, which was huge and amazing for the impact on social emotional learning. Okay. So they did the BASC, and the results of the pre and the post test using the BASC 2, I think they have a BASC 3 now, it's the behavioral assessment scales for children. They looked at several different areas, and what they saw was the biggest changes were in atypicality, which is definitely falling under the self-awareness and social awareness part of the 5 core competencies, and then adaptability as well, which plays a huge role in decision-making and self-management. And so those were the 3 biggest areas that showed a 10-point change in a T scale, in a T scale score. And that's pretty significant. They also had some really great results with social skills and attention problems. And all they were really doing was increasing the movement, becoming more self-aware of what they were choosing, and into incorporating more sensory input into the classroom. okay? And that is what ended up changing. It was changing measures of the social emotional learning. This slide shows the pre and the post-test changes using the sensory processing measure. And again, when we're changing sensory input or adding sensory input, I think we would expect to see bigger changes in some of the areas like visual and auditory processing. But they did see some change there, but where we saw the biggest changes were on the measure of social skills. And that is very exciting and amazing because that is literally what we need them to have. They have to be able to function in their environment with other people, right? So that is spectacular. And then again, that's what we use the research for the Just Right curriculum. The study was also done in homes, and parents were able to choose their target behavior as they felt that were rooted in sensory issues. And they tracked data on a chosen behavior for 7 days, and they submitted a sensory checklist to Gwen, and she set up a sensory diet for them using the BrainWorks program. And they tracked data for 14 days with the sensory diet in place. And the data shows comparison between the pre and the intervention phase. And one of the biggest areas was they saw a big difference in emotional over-responsiveness. And this program was really designed to be taught in a classroom, essentially, to meet the needs of all the students in the classroom. But it can be used in small group or individualized sessions as well. The best way to do it is by using that team approach, because we literally tried to think of everything and how everybody could really work together. And that's exactly how we can increase carryover and generalization. So you can teach it in a variety of different ways. The therapist can lead the sessions in the classroom or in the small group or individual sessions, or maybe the teacher and the therapist can share the responsibilities, because we even have scripts inside every single lesson. So you could know nothing about sensory processing disorder and still be able to teach it. And obviously you can co-teach. We tried to think of everything to make it as easy as possible for people who have lack of time, because that is literally, I think, my life. So each lesson really should take anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. There's a couple lessons that maybe could take more than that, where you could just split them into 2 separate lessons. The times are definitely not set in stone. You can kind of skip around, you can add things, you can do whatever you want depending on what you need. But your child will be the students will be creating tools. So you do need something. Like I have a second grade classroom that's doing it this year, and they have their sensory folder. So the teacher gave everybody just a folder, and everything that they make, they put into their sensory folder. We also have provided you with videos and handouts so that it makes it hands-on. That's why YouTube is so spectacular, because everybody watches YouTube videos nowadays. So we wanted to make sure that you had videos, like how-to videos, and you can even use them to show the kids if you want as well. We also have given you 6 different types of modifications. So, ways to adapt it for an individual session. You'll see all those in a second, but we really just want to make sure that you have a way of utilizing this program in whatever setting you might be. And most importantly, like I said, if you know nothing about sensory modulation, we try to make it as easy as possible for you to follow along by providing you with scripts for exactly what to say. So we even give in there in bold italicized writing, we'll even say what the question is and then what possible answers you could possibly get, So we provided you with that. Can you modify that? Absolutely. However, during those times when you may not know what to say, you can just stick to the script if you want, or you can go improv, whatever you want. So this is just a brief explanation of what the lessons look like. There's always an overview in the beginning. It's just a brief explanation of what's happening. There's always materials to know exactly what you're going to need and what you need to prepare for before you start your lesson. Every lesson has a review of what happened in the lesson before, except for lesson 1. Obviously, that's the introduction. Every one of them has the main concepts, and that's just a kid-friendly overview of the lesson topic. You can see here the script is in the bold italicized words with possible answers. At the end of the lesson, we always have a wrap-up which has possible follow-up questions, where you can kind of just make sure they understand what they learned during that session. And then really importantly, there's a carryover section, which is where, like, say, as the OT, I'm teaching this lesson to the classroom. Now I don't come back until a week later. This is the type of stuff that you would do during the entire week to carry over the concepts that you used. And then here you go. These are the 6 different modifications. If you need it to modify it for distance learning, individual sessions, younger children, older children. It was primarily made for around the 2nd grade level. So that's, if you're going younger, it would be kindergarten to 2nd. If you're going older, I would say just higher than 2nd grade. And sometimes even my 4th and 5th graders that I work with I would still give them the younger version, you know. In fact, this year I'm even teaching my 4th and 5th graders the Just Right Junior version, which was initially designed for preschool or emerging learners. So it's, you know, the concepts depends on the level of maturity and their developmental levels, right? And then if you're already using an emotional regulation program that has specific colors that don't match up to the colors in these programs, how would you adapt that to make it work for both? This is a little bit of a tricky part. Some people read the lessons and they're like, what are these character responses? This is just a resource for you. We provide a thorough explanation of the 4 types of characters at the very beginning of the book, so you understand what the 4 characters are. And then at the end of every single lesson, we give you a little snapshot of how these types of students might react to your lesson, right? So this is just reference for you. This is not anything you actually have to do. They're just suggestions, like maybe like lesson 2 where they have to run in circles. You don't want to put the sensory seeking Susie type of child with the too fast Freddy who gets very overstimulated, right? So these strategies would help you teach the lesson a little bit easier or better. Okay. So it's nothing like that you need to like teach the kids about. It's just more a reference for you. All of the lessons are in there. You also, when you buy the curriculum, you'll see on the 2nd page that there's a password protected section on the OTKimWiggins.com website. This is where you put you put the password into the website. Let me just show you real quick. Oops. So you just hover on the shop button and then you go into the K-5, or if you bought the junior, you would go there. And when you click on that, I already did it. When you click on that, you put in the password and it gives you this password protected site that gives you pre and post tests for you. It gives you just right the goals. It gives you parent handouts. It gives you some RTI information. It gives you the full playlist of all of the songs. I'm sorry, all of the videos. And then it also gives you what the handouts are. So you can go ahead and just click on that. And then you have the handouts that you can just print right from here instead of going to the book and printing them, or, you know, making copies at a copy machine. You can just print them right from the website. If you, that just makes it easy that you can access it anywhere, because you can just type in OTKimWiggins.com, sign in with the password, and you automatically have all of the handouts at your fingertips. So this is just an example of what that looks like. And also for the different types of handouts that you have, this is something that we tried to we wanted to, since K-5, I mean, kindergarten and 5th graders are completely different, right? But we still believed in the concept for each lesson, but we realized the handouts might have to be different. So pay attention to what handout you need to use. Obviously, I'm not giving this out to a kindergartner, right? In fact, I might not even give this out to a 5th grader, depending on their reading skills. They might do better with this one, right? So you might just go look for what lesson it is and what the suggestion is. Same goes for with equipment or without equipment. Ideally, we want to teach sensory modulation to children that they don't actually need any equipment. If they're out in the community at Walmart, they can't just randomly start using a tunnel or a scooter somewhere, right? They might have to, do an animal walk, or they might have to do dots and squeezes with their arms and their hands, things that they can do with their own bodies that they don't actually need pieces of equipment. However, we did realize that clinic-based therapists might have a different situation, or maybe at home you might have different situation. So some of the handouts have options for without equipment and with equipment. So you want to make sure that you choose the one that's best for you. The purpose of the videos, every single lesson has the playlist link, okay? And when you go to the playlist link, you'll see the YouTube channel that is the Just Right Sensory Modulation Curriculum channel, and it has a video for each one of the lessons. And it's really there because it's easier to learn things visually, I think, sometimes. So you get to see it in action, so you know exactly what to do, and you can watch a couple minutes of a video rather than sitting through the book and reading every single script if you'd want to do it that way. It also shows you different examples and different things that you can try. And sometimes you might want to read the scripts through the book when you're actually teaching it, but it's helpful just to watch the video before you go and teach it, just so that you have a better heads up on what you should be doing. There are a couple of different terms and analogies. These are the three concepts that we teach in the curriculum. We talk about brain and body speeds. So we talk about brain speeds, then we talk about body speeds first, then we talk about brain speeds. We also use the concepts of fast, slow, and just right. And we also talk about gasoline tank size, because we want to talk about what size tank do you have for your touch tank. Do you have a big tank or a little tank? When you talk about your sound tank, right? Do you have a big tank or a little tank, or a just right tank? And depending on what size tank you have, you know if you need more input or if you need less input, okay? So this is, I just quickly will go through some of the lessons. Lesson 1, we're learning about the concept of just fast and slow. That's it. And the best way we could think of that is just with cars. And when doing in the classroom, I bring 3 kids to the front of the classroom and tell them what speed they will be moving, and give them a car on a piece of yarn. So let me just show you that real quick. Okay, so you kind of get an idea of how that lesson would go. That's just everybody gets a chance to do it. Everybody gets a chance to be a different speed, that type of thing. And I just tie yarn onto a Matchbox car, and I just keep that tied on. And every single time I teach this lesson, I have my 3 cars with the yarn on them already. Okay. With lesson 2, what you do is you do a movement activity. So now we are talking about your body speed. So there's 3 kids in a circle, and we make this tool right here, the spinning tool. And what happens is we spin it, and I might assign each kid a different speed. And sometimes it might be that all 3 kids are slow, or it might be 2 kids are fast and 1 kid is just right, or whatever it ends up being. Each kid gets to spin whatever speed they're going to be. And then I usually give them just a piece of paper with their speed on it, so they don't forget, because they often forget. And then they have to walk in a circle, or run in a circle, or be a slow motion person in a circle, while all 3 of them are doing it at the same time. So it gives them some really good self-awareness, like, oh my gosh, when I run, I could bump into somebody. Or actually, if I'm being super, super slow and someone else is running, I'm actually kind of scared that they might bump into me, right? Or whatever. We can talk about lots of different scenarios there. Every single lesson has goals that are correlated with it. So you can actually use these goals for your sensory goals. So maybe you want to write a sensory goal from lesson 10, right? And you can utilize that all school year to get to that point where they have shown and demonstrated it. Lesson 3 is where they actually make their own speedometers. And this is where now these are their own speedometers. So we're going to use these for almost every single lesson after they make them. And lesson 3 is just about making them and putting them together and understanding all the concepts that go into this. And it works on the fine motor skills. It works on some writing skills. It works on hole punchers, and it's super fun. So those are there's how-to videos in there as well. But basically what happened is, maybe we're doing lesson 14 and I say, okay, how are you feeling? Then everybody has to change it and put it on top of their head. Or maybe the teacher utilizes these speedometers on a regular basis during morning meeting. That's part of their topic. I have teachers that keep them, they Velcro them right onto their desks. So at any time they can change their speed level. So the teacher has an awareness of if they're feeling fast, slow, or just right now. Okay. So they know what kind of movement breaks to do. After lesson 3, we start talking about the sensory systems a little bit more specifically. So lesson 4 is about the FAR senses. So this is the graphic that Gwen and I created that kind of gives them an understanding that there are 5 FAR senses that happen from the world around us that come into our body. We can't control those types of things. They come into our body. The sounds come in, the visuals come in, the smells come in, people touching us or us touching other things. That all comes into us. Those are the 5 FAR senses. But we also have 3 near senses, and those are senses that you can't see or hear, and they are inside our body. That's vestibular, interoception, and proprioception. So lesson 4 is all about the FAR senses: visual, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile. And it teaches them about them, and also how it makes them feel fast, slow, or just right. So they'll be creating different things with handouts and activities for that. Then we talk about the near senses: proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. But each one of these near senses, because they're a little bit more complex or more complicated, each one of these has their own lesson. So, like, for example, we have lesson 5, and lesson 5 is all about proprioception. I have to say, it is the absolute cutest thing in the world to hear a kindergartner say, I need proprioception. And they learn the word proprioception. It's probably the most remembered word out of the entire curriculum, which is phenomenal. They can go home at dinner and talk to their parents about proprioception, and they're going to teach them something. And we have so many great activities in this lesson that teaches them what proprioception is. That is a hard concept for adults to learn, but you could even use those lessons to teach proprioception to parents. That's how good, like they're really, really helpful and they really get them to understand it. Then we have our vestibular lesson, and that's about balance and movement. And this is the kind of stuff that, again, when are we supposed to be moving fast? When are we supposed to be moving slow? When are we supposed to be just right? What types of things help us fill our tank? What types of things make our tank feel less empty? Those types of things, okay? And then what we do in the vestibular lesson is, where in the proprioception lesson, they learn all about proprioception. Vestibular, they learn about it also, but then we do a voting activity where the kids have to vote on different types of movement activities and decide if they make them feel fast, slow, or just right. And like I said, every single lesson can be modified to be in a small group or an individual session. So this is an example of how to make the vestibular lesson 6 in an individual or a small group lesson instead of a classroom lesson. Interoception is a complicated topic for sure. So lesson 7 is all about interoception, and you're basically looking at a couple of different body parts like the heart, the brain, the muscles and joints, and even the bladder we talk about. And that one causes a few giggles because everyone pees, but it's still hilarious, right? So we actually talk about, explicitly teach about when you need to pee, right? And what does that actually feel like, and different things like that. And it's again, there's goals specifically for interoception if that's something. Sensory goals are hard to write, so I wanted to make sure that you had kind of like a baseline type of goal, and you can adapt it to meet your students' needs. But how you can actually write some of those goals by using this Just Right curriculum as well, that can be more like generalized. This is the gas and brake pedal. So after we learn about our senses and fast and slow and just right, we have to understand, what do we have to do to make ourselves go faster or make ourselves go slower? So this is actually a video. Oh, I just had a little hiccup. Hold on. So this is just an example. Basically, they become their own brake and gas pedals. So gas pedal, they lean all the way back. Brake pedal, they lean forward. So they're doing sit-ups and crunches and getting some sensory input at the same time as learning this concept. Lesson 9 is experiments. So now what they've done is, you can kind of see it. It's a bad picture, but it's all of the senses, and there's always 2 pictures for every sense, and we try them. So this is where you bring in crackers and things that are taste spicy or smell spicy, or movement things. So it gives you all the examples that you'll need in the materials, and it's very simple. And then everybody gets to try it, and then they decide, does it make them feel fast, or is it a gas pedal activity, or would it be a brake pedal activity where it makes them feel slower? And then they can glue it onto their handout. So this is the kids actually cutting out the pieces and putting them on the chart. And this is just a video of ASMR, the kids watching ASMR, so that this is the visual example where they're watching a calming activity like ASMR, or they're watching a alerting visual input like a disco light, and then they have to then glue it onto their papers. Lesson 10 is literally about how to make a sensory diet tool folder. So we're going to glue this from speedometer 3 or lesson 3 We're going to get that same handout and glue it onto the front cover of the manila folder. And then we're going to talk about how brake pedal activities are on the red side. And maybe you don't need to use the colors if you're already doing something else, but you can say the brake pedal activities are on this side, the gas pedal activities are on this side, and the just right pedal or just right activities are in the middle. And that's all you do for lesson 10. Lesson 11, 12, and 13 are all the same, but basically what you're doing is, for this handout, you're going through each one of them as a group, and you're crossing off or putting a dot on the one that helps you or doesn't help you. If it isn't a gas pedal activity that you like, you cross it off after we try it. If it is something you like, we just put a little dot on it because we're going to cut it out. And then what ends up happening is you end up putting all of those, after each lesson, you put them into your sensory diet tool folder based on your preferences. So everyone ends up getting their own individualized sensory diet tool folder, which is very helpful. And I know we're almost done, so I just wanted to quickly touch on that. Once we make a sensory diet tool folder, we should be making sure that sensory breaks are structured, obviously based on their sensory needs, which is what they're figuring out in this whole entire curriculum. So it ends up being very individualized, and it should be choice-based. So yeah, maybe they need a gas pedal activity. They have a variety of choices, not just one thing, right? So they open up their folder and it is very structured. They understand it. It's based on their sensory need that they have chosen, and it's choice-based. The starting point for how much time they should be doing those activities is based on their developmental age. So if developmentally they're between K and first grade, then they should be doing something in their sensory diet tool folder every hour for up to 10 minutes, okay? As they get older, the space between every sensory break that they have can increase, right? But also it just depends on their developmental age, not necessarily their chronological age. Okay, and last but not least, we learn about our tank sizes, and we learn that, you know, your tank size is based on your sensory modulation continuum here. And we do that by doing some role play activities. And every time we have 3 characters, and every time the characters get sensory input, a cotton ball is added to their cup. And you'll notice that the kids that have the character that has a tiny touch tank ends up being all the cotton balls end up falling out, right? They get overstimulated quickly. Whereas the same amount of input was provided to the one with the large touch tank, didn't even get to the rim, right? So that is a really big aha moment for a lot of kids. And kids are saying, oh, I have a big touch tank, but I have a small sound tank, you know, those types of things, which is pretty cool to hear them say. And then after they hear that whole lesson, then they decide, you know, we go through them all and they get to decide if it's a large, small, or medium tank for each one of the senses. And last but not least, 15 and 16 lessons are based on, what do we do with this folder? Now we have the folder. So what do we do? What they do is they use role plays, and I have scripts that are easy to read for different levels of grades, and there's additional ones on the website under the password protected section, and they do the role plays. And now I've had 4-year-olds learn these role plays, and I just speak the words into their ear and then they repeat it. Obviously they're not always able to read at that point. So this is probably the biggest favorite thing that every kid absolutely loves, doing the role plays. Even if they don't want to act, I make them the director, or they are, you know, they're the stage hands, or whatever it is. So this ends up being a really, really fun activity for both lessons 15 and 16. And at the very end, everyone gets a certificate. Just like in Just Right Junior, everybody gets a certificate, and they get to go home and explain all the different types of things that they're learning. So I will be on for a couple of minutes to take questions. I know we went over just a minute right now, but overall, the biggest thing that I just want to point out is that A balanced brain really is the foundation to social and emotional learning. And the way that we can be balanced is by meeting the sensory modulation needs. So social, emotional, and sensory modulation really go hand in hand, and it's really important that we be addressing both parts. The last thing is, just if you didn't know this already, I have a lot of digital resources that are available on my website as well, so you can definitely take a look at that. And if you have any additional questions after today, you can always contact me through my social media or email me or go get me through my website. And if you have to leave, thank you very much for coming. What I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, so we have just a couple questions we'll go through, and you did provide your context, so if we don't get to that's there, but let's see if we can get through a couple here. The first one, can you just repeat the full title and author of the book, Too Loud, Too Fast?
It's too loud. Oh, wait, let me find it so I don't mess it up. Hold on. Too loud, too bright, hold on. It's Too Loud, Too Bright, Too Fast, Too Tight. And it is by Sharon Heller, Heller. Too loud,
Perfect.
too bright, too fast, too tight.
All right. Do you have recommendations for kids who may be sensory seeking but dysregulate themselves when attempting to meet their needs, like spinning?
So one of the things that is probably an issue is going into sensory rooms. Now, I love the idea of sensory rooms, but only if they're being utilized correctly. So sensory rooms need to be structured, and one of the great things about using this curriculum is that they should be choosing things from their own individualized sensory diet tool folder, right? So yeah, maybe they even put in spinning as something that they really like, and then they become overstimulated by it. Those are things that are going to have to be trial and error, right? And sometimes what it is, and this happens all the time, and teachers and aides, paraprofessionals often are like, you want them to do what? So when it comes to spinning, in my opinion, and with a lot of kids, it's not always the case. A lot of times they are not spinning long enough or more as intense as they need it to be. So, you know how like maybe you have one potato chip and it becomes a tease, or you have one M&M and your tease, like it's just a tease. You now all of a sudden you didn't even want M&Ms. Now you just ate one and now you want to have the entire bag of M&Ms, right? So the same thing happens with spinning. You have to get to the threshold where it actually provides a calming input. Now, a lot of kids are overstimulated by spinning. So when you are doing spinning, there's a whole protocol behind that. And what I do is I look for a post-rotary nystagmus. So when you are spinning in each direction and they have any type of post-rotary nystagmus, that means that they have met that threshold. If I'm spinning them and they don't reach the post-rotary nystagmus where they do not have a nystagmus until I spin them however many times in each direction, when they finally get the nystagmus, then I know that they've met their need. So it's something that obviously an OT who's trained in that would need to be involved with that type of situation.
All right. The link for the 23 ways to create sensory friendly classrooms, where can that be found?
It's on Inspired Treehouse. I think you can just, if you just type in Inspired Treehouse, 23 ways to create a sensory friendly classroom. It's from 2015, but it's a really good resource.
Okay. And how do you find time to do lessons in the classroom? Teachers tell me they don't have time to do movement breaks because of how structured their schedules and curriculum are.
Right. So this is something I teach a lot of courses about pushing into the classroom and collaboration. I've been in the schools, primarily in this particular school, for 20 years, and I've heard them all. I've heard all of the excuses, the complaints, even myself giving excuses and complaints about doing things like that. When I started doing more push-ins to the classrooms, I started to see more progress, and kids actually started making more progress to the point where I could decrease them or discontinue them from the services. And so over the years, over time, I push into the classrooms more and more and more and more. And I tend to like to have the control of what they're learning. You can push in a variety of different ways, and that's what I talk about in my courses. One of the ways that we typically push in is by sitting next to the student and helping them with whatever the activity is that they're doing in the classroom. However, one of the other ways that you can push into the classroom is by being a therapist-led teacher. So you, as the therapist, are leading the class in an activity, a lesson, a motor lab, a curriculum, a handwriting lesson, whatever you're doing, and you're doing it for the sake of that one student. So instead of pulling your OT student out into your pull-out session, who most likely has cognitive delays, poor carryover, poor generalization, and what we do is we try to teach them those skills in the most restrictive environment where nobody else can hear that, us and them. And then we send them back to the classroom and we expect them to carry over what they learned. And they usually don't really like doing some of those things either. So they're probably not motivated to do that. So what we don't end up seeing a lot of progress. So when I give that example to teachers and say, what I would like to try doing is teaching the lesson to the entire classroom. So it's here to help you out. It's here to give tier 1 or tier 2 strategies to all these other students in your classroom and focus on making sure Tommy gets what he needs. Then that tends to be one of the ways of encouraging teachers to let you do things like that. And it's only one out of the time out of the week for 30 minutes, So it is going to be beneficial. And if we can also utilize that as a tier 1 or tier 2 approach, it kind of kills two birds with one stone.
Awesome. What if their sensory needs change after the folders are made and the lessons are not taught anymore? Who adds new activities, the OT or the teacher?
Well, it depends. I think that kids now have, after they use the curriculum, it's a great question, but I think a lot of times what happens is now that they've been more self-aware of what their needs are, they can make those decisions themselves. Also, what ends up happening is they end up using the folder for a period of time, and then they don't need the folder anymore. They end up understanding the concept of when I feel fast, I need to slow down. What's something that helps me slow down, right? And as they get older, as they mature, as the environment changes, as the options change, they can start to do that themselves because they learned the basic concept behind it, which is, I think, one of the biggest things that we're lacking when we give out these sensory pieces of equipment to kids without doing a lot of explicit teaching, right? They need to have that full understanding of how they can self-advocate for themselves and know what language they can use to help other people understand, oh, I need to use this, I need to use that. They don't always need to use the folder. What if they made the folder and now they're at grandma's house and they don't have the folder? What are we supposed to do? So that's what lesson 16 does. Is lesson 16 is called Beyond the Folder. And so lesson 16 teaches them that, oh, what am I supposed to do when I don't have my folder? I kind of have to remember what are things that make me feel fast, slow, or just right. Hopefully that answers.
All right. All right. The handouts are behind you. You said they were on your website, but you couldn't find them there.
Yes, this is something that you have to purchase, and it's in the store.
Okay.
Or in the shop, I guess you would say. It's a shop.
In the shop. Okay. Let's try to do one more, and then you have your contact there so we can kind of get everybody out of here tonight. If wanting to implement Just Right curriculum in the school classroom setting, does the school pay or does the OT pay?
So if you wanted to utilize the Just Right curriculum into the school, into the whole school, I offer bulk discounts. So the school would pay for that, I would hope. If you just wanted to get your feet wet with, or I've had a lot of school districts across the country and actually in other countries as well. What they do is the OT purchases the curriculum and they kind of utilize it. They do it for a classroom here or there. And then they end up using it as that classroom as a pilot program to show that's why the pre and post test is on the password protected part of my site, because there's districts that chose to use that pre and post test as a way to justify that all of the first grades or all of the fourth grades or the whole school needs to learn this curriculum. And it just has the data there so that it justifies the district paying for it. So it can be both ways. I know me personally, what I end up doing usually is I end up buying something because I want to use it as the therapist. And then when like, for example, handwriting without tears, right? That's something that I wanted to learn. And then once I started learning it and teaching it, then I had our school district buy the overall program so that more kids could use it.